He once said a whole civilization would die that night, never to be brought back again. Today he says, missiles are not the problem, they just hurt a little location. In the space of a few months, the President of the United States has gone from threatening to erase a nation off the map to shrugging off the very weapons he once called an existential threat to America. This is not a story about Iran. This is a story about how the most powerful man on earth can change his entire war story while expecting nobody to notice. And if you stick with me for the next few minutes, you're going to see exactly how many times the goalposts moved, who said what and when, and why the deal being celebrated today looks almost nothing like the war that was promised at the very beginning. If this is the kind of deep dive that keeps you informed while everyone else is just scrolling past headlines, smash that like button right now and subscribe, because we break stories down like this every single day. Let's go back to where this all really began, because to understand how far Trump has walked back his own words, you need to remember how big those words were in the first place. On June 13th, 2025, Israel launched a surprise wave of strikes against Iranian nuclear infrastructure, tearing into the Natanz centrifuge hall, its power systems, and its support buildings. That was the spark. Within days, the international community was watching a region that had been simmering for years suddenly catch fire. The Israeli strikes degraded Iran's air defenses so severely that what came next barely faced any resistance at all. On June 21st and 22, 2025, the United States carried out its own operation, and it gave that operation a name built for headlines: Operation Midnight Hammer. 7 B-2 Spirit stealth bombers lifted off from Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri and flew east for 18 straight hours, refueling in midair multiple times, headed for 3 targets buried deep in Iranian territory. At the same time, other B-2s flew west over the Pacific as decoys, a deliberate deception meant to confuse anyone watching. More than 125 aircraft took part in the operation altogether. 6 of the bombers dropped 12 so-called bunker buster bombs, GBU-57, massive ordnance penetrators, each weighing 30,000 pounds, onto the Fordo enrichment plant, a facility buried so deep inside a mountain that conventional weapons could never touch it. A 7th bomber dropped 2 more on the Natanz facility. Meanwhile, a U.S. submarine in the region fired more than 24 Tomahawk cruise missiles at the Isfahan Nuclear Technology Center. The entire bombing run lasted around 25 minutes. Not a single shot was fired back at the American aircraft. That's right. The most secretive and dangerous strike package in recent American military history flew deep into Iranian airspace and came home without a scratch. If that fact alone doesn't make your jaw drop, wait until you hear what Trump said happened next. But first, if you're enjoying this breakdown, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss where this story goes. Standing at the White House after those strikes, Trump did not hold back. He declared that the United States had destroyed Iran's nuclear enrichment capacity and stopped the nuclear threat completely. He told the American people that Iran's key nuclear enrichment facilities had been completely and totally obliterated. Those were not vague diplomatic words. Those were absolute, total, no room for doubt declarations from the most powerful office on the planet. He framed the mission as having ended the danger once and for all. For a moment, it looked like the story had a clean ending. Strikes happened, danger eliminated, mission accomplished. Except almost immediately, that narrative started cracking. A leaked Defense Intelligence Agency assessment, issued with what officials called low confidence, suggested that the strikes may have only set Iran's nuclear program back by a matter of months, not years, and certainly not the total elimination Trump had promised the country. Administration officials were furious about the leak, and they pushed back hard, with the CIA Director's office insisting the facilities had in fact been severely damaged. But independent experts who study satellite imagery for a living told a different story. Dr. Jeffrey Lewis, a nuclear expert at the Middlebury Institute of International Studies, pointed out on social media that infrastructure surrounding all 3 nuclear sites still appeared largely intact, including the facilities used to manufacture centrifuges. Even more striking, Iran still held a stockpile of more than 400 kilograms of uranium enriched above 60%, which experts say could theoretically be refined further into enough material for up to 10-0. Nuclear weapons, if pushed to weapons-grade purity, so the man who told America the threat was obliterated, was, according to people who actually study this material for a living, possibly off by years, not days. And if that kind of contradiction surprises you, you need to stay till the end of this video, because it only gets messier from here, so go ahead and tap that like and subscribe button now before you forget. Trump didn't stop at claiming the nuclear threat was gone. He went further, framing the entire operation as something much bigger than a strike on enrichment facilities. He called it the single greatest chance for the Iranian people to take back their country. Days later, after Israeli and American strikes had killed Iran's supreme leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, a man Trump called one of the most evil people in history, Trump told reporters there's automatically a regime change. pointing out that all the previous leaders were dead and that his team was now dealing with new people he described as very reasonable, very solid. He even posted online that if Iran's leadership couldn't, in his words, make Iran great again, he would expect a change in leadership to follow. This was as close as a sitting American president has come in decades to openly stating that toppling a foreign government was part of the plan. But here's where things get genuinely strange. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth stood at the same podium and told reporters the operation was not about regime change, even as Trump was publicly inviting Iranians to seize control of their destiny. Two of the most senior officials in the American government could not agree in real time on whether their own war was meant to topple a government or not. Imagine launching the most secretive bombing run in a generation and not having your own cabinet on the same page about why you're doing it. Then, months later, after a preliminary peace deal had been signed, Trump stood in front of reporters at the G7 summit and said something that should stop you in your tracks. He said, quote, "You talk about regime change? I never cared about regime change. It was never a part." Read that again. The same man who told the world there was automatically a regime change, who invited an entire nation to seize control of their destiny, who watched as his own defense secretary publicly contradicted him on this exact point, was now standing in front of the cameras claiming he never cared about it at all. Commentators compared it to someone getting rejected by a date and then insisting they never wanted to go out with that person anyway. That is not just a shift in messaging. That is a complete rewrite of the historical record, delivered with a straight face to a room full of journalists who watched the entire thing unfold in real time. If you didn't know this swing existed before today, that's exactly why content like this matters, so make sure you've hit subscribe and dropped a like, because we're only getting started. Let's talk about the missiles, because this is maybe the most jaw-dropping flip of the entire saga. Before the war began, and throughout the early weeks of the conflict, Trump and his top officials treated Iran's ballistic missile arsenal as one of the central justifications for military action. In his very first comments, after announcing the February 28th strikes, Trump claimed Iran had been building missiles that could soon reach the American homeland, a claim that, according to reporting at the time, was not backed by any public American intelligence assessment. Defense Secretary Hegseth accused Tehran of building missiles and drones to create what he called a conventional shield for its nuclear ambitions. Secretary of State Marco Rubio went even further, alleging that Iran was producing 100 ballistic missiles every single month specifically so they could, in his words, hide behind that arsenal and avoid consequences for their nuclear program. Senior administration officials laid out 4 explicit military objectives for the war, and destroying Iran's ballistic missile arsenal, along with its ability to produce more of those weapons, was one of just 4 pillars of the entire mission. Before the war, Iran held one of the largest ballistic missile stockpiles anywhere in the Middle East, somewhere between 2,500 and 6,000 missiles of varying types, some capable of flying more than 2,000 kilometers, some carrying cluster munition warheads that are notoriously difficult to defend against. This was treated, publicly and repeatedly, as a 5-alarm national security threat that justified American bombs falling on a foreign country. Now fast forward to the G7 summit, after the interim deal had already been signed. Trump stood in front of reporters and said, quote, "Missiles are not the problem." He went on, describing them this way: "They hurt a little location, but they don't blow up the planet." He added that Iran has to have some missiles because, in his words, other people have some. Pause on that for a second. The same missile arsenal that was once framed as a reason to bomb a sovereign nation was now being described as something that just hurts a little location. The final agreement contains no requirement whatsoever for Iran to dismantle its missile program. None. The single loudest justification for war simply evaporated from the final paperwork. If you're someone who pays attention to how leaders justify going to war, this is exactly the kind of detail that should make you pause. And it's exactly why you should like this video and subscribe before the next twist, because there's more. Now let's talk about enriched uranium, because this one might be even more revealing than the missiles. Throughout the entire conflict, Trump insisted, again and again, that any final agreement had to include Iran surrendering its stockpile of highly enriched uranium. Officials pressed Tehran hard on this exact point, treating it as a non-negotiable red line. This wasn't a minor technical detail buried in a policy paper. This was front and center in nearly every public statement about what victory would look like. The fear was simple and well documented. Iran's enriched uranium stockpile, if pushed to weapons-grade levels, could provide the raw material for multiple nuclear weapons. After the Memorandum of Understanding was signed, something changed almost overnight. At the G7 summit, Trump began describing that same uranium stockpile, which he nicknamed nuclear dust, as something that was, in his words, not really valuable. He asked reporters a rhetorical question that should honestly stop any serious observer in their tracks. You could make the case. Why even bother? The man who spent months telling the country that Iran handing over this exact material was essential to ending the threat was now publicly wondering out loud whether it was even worth pursuing. The final agreement leaves the question of Iran's uranium stockpile completely unresolved, kicked down the road into future negotiations that have no guaranteed timeline. An issue that was once treated as absolutely non-negotiable is now, by the president's own words, something he's not sure was ever worth the fight. And if a complete 180 like that doesn't shake your trust in official war narratives, I genuinely don't know what will. So if you're still with me, smash like and subscribe right now, because we're about to get into the human cost behind all of this political theater. Because here's the thing nobody wants to put front and center. Behind every one of these shifting talking points, real people are dying. When Hezbollah joined the conflict on March 2nd, launching missiles and drones into Israel, the Israeli response included airstrikes and a ground invasion into Lebanon that, according to Lebanon's own health ministry, killed nearly 3,700 people, including women, children, medical personnel, and first responders. Roughly 1.2 million people were displaced from their homes in Lebanon alone. On the Israeli side, officials reported 22 soldiers, 1 military contractor, and 2 civilians killed in Hezbollah attacks during that same window. Meanwhile, inside Iran itself, several thousand people are believed to have been killed across the American and Israeli strikes throughout the broader campaign. These are not abstract statistics in a policy memo. These are families, neighborhoods, entire communities that absorbed the human cost of a war whose stated purpose kept shifting depending on which week you were listening. And even as the diplomatic track moved forward, the ceasefire that was supposed to hold barely did. In March, Trump again threatened to attack Iran's power plants and bridges if the Strait of Hormuz was not reopened. On April 7th, in a moment that genuinely stunned observers, Trump posted that a whole civilization will die tonight, never to be brought back, warning Iran that failure to reach an agreement with the United States would carry consequences almost too large to comprehend. Administration officials later quietly confirmed that the statement was improvisational and not part of any formal national security plan, which is its own kind of terrifying. The idea that a threat of that magnitude, civilizational language used by the President of the United States, was simply something said in the moment rather than a calculated piece of strategy. CNN tracked Trump's public statements between March 23rd and June 9th and found that he had claimed a deal was imminent at least 38 separate times during that window. 38 times. If someone in your life told you something was about to happen 38 times and it kept not happening, you'd probably stop believing them by about attempt number 5. If you just felt that mental math land, that's your sign to like this video and subscribe, because the timeline only gets wilder. By late May, the situation had escalated again. On May 25th, international media reported that the United States had conducted military operations in southern Iran, targeting missile launch sites and boats in the Strait of Hormuz, even while ceasefire conditions were technically supposed to be in effect and negotiations were still ongoing. U.S. Central Command described these as defensive strikes responding to perceived maritime threats. Around the same time, IRGC General Rezai stated that Iranian forces were prepared to attack the blockade if Trump betrayed the negotiations, while White House Deputy Chief of Staff Stephen Miller claimed Iran had already made significant concessions, including reopening the strait. Two governments, both claiming progress, both simultaneously threatening renewed violence. That is not what a stable peace process looks like. That is two sides circling each other with weapons still drawn while diplomats argue over paperwork. Then came June. On June 11th, American embassies across Iraq and other Arab states began evacuating personnel in direct response to Iranian threats against American bases. The Houthis publicly threatened retaliation against the United States if any new attack was launched on Iran. The United Kingdom issued a formal threat advisory for commercial ships in the Persian Gulf. On June 12th, the International Atomic Energy Agency formally declared Iran in breach of its non-proliferation obligations, a serious diplomatic escalation in its own right. By June 13th, Israel had launched another round of large-scale attacks, targeting Iran's military leadership and nuclear scientists, and Iran responded by withdrawing from nuclear talks entirely and suspending negotiations indefinitely. Trying to strong-arm the American negotiating team, saying Iranian insistence on continuing enrichment activity had hampered any realistic path to an agreement. He also claimed Iranian negotiators boasted privately about having deceived international monitors. If true, that is an extraordinary admission, suggesting the very inspection systems meant to verify Iran's compliance may have been actively undermined from the inside the entire time. And yet, despite all of that, a framework was reached. As part of a 14-point memorandum of understanding, both sides agreed to commit to further talks over the next 60 days, with a $300 billion plan attached for Iran's reconstruction. Read that figure again, $300 billion in reconstruction funding for the very nation that was bombed under the justification of eliminating an existential nuclear threat. Commercial vessels and oil tankers, which had been sitting anxiously in the Gulf of Oman, waiting to transit the Strait of Hormuz, one of the most critical waterways for global trade, were finally able to move again. Speaking from the G7 summit in France, Trump said he hoped the deal would deliver peace across the region and lower oil prices worldwide. He also issued one more warning that perfectly captures the contradictions running through this entire saga. He said, quote, "If you don't adhere to the agreement, I don't want to do that, but we're going to bomb the hell out of you." In the very same breath as celebrating peace, the threat of renewed bombing was sitting right there, like a loaded weapon placed gently on the negotiating table. If a single sentence can hold both an olive branch and a bomb threat at once, that tells you everything about how fragile this entire arrangement really is. So if your mind is racing right now, like this video and subscribe, because we still need to talk about who actually benefits from this deal. Because here's the part that has economists and energy analysts raising their eyebrows. Despite nearly 4 months of war, thousands of lives lost, and the most secretive bombing run in recent American military history, analysts are now openly questioning whether the final outcome actually favors Tehran more than Washington. Iran agreed to the right to enrich uranium, gained access to billions of dollars in previously frozen funds, and secured the ability to continue developing ballistic missiles, 3 things that had been treated as absolute red lines by the Trump administration for the entire duration of the conflict. Torbjorn Soltvedt, a principal Middle East analyst at the risk intelligence firm Verisk Maplecroft, noted in a research report that Tehran will retain what he called significant leverage once negotiators turn to the unresolved questions around its nuclear program, its missile arsenal, and its support for armed groups throughout the region. He pointed out that the disruption Iran caused to global shipping and energy infrastructure over those 3.5 months of conflict actually strengthened, not weakened, Iran's negotiating position going forward. Let that sink in for a moment. The war that was supposed to cripple Iran's leverage may have, according to actual risk analysts who study this for a living, ended up handing Iran more leverage than it had before the bombs ever fell. And through it all, Trump has continued defending the outcome using a justification that feels worlds away from where this entire story started. At the G7 summit, he framed the deal as necessary to avoid what he called a global economic catastrophe, saying he didn't want to see severe consequences ripple through markets and global trade. Compare that explanation to where this all began, a video address on February 28th, the day the war started, where Trump told the Iranian people, "When we are finished, take over your government, it will be yours to take," calling it probably their only chance for generations. From toppling a government to protecting stock markets, from obliterating a nuclear threat to questioning whether the uranium was ever worth chasing, from missiles being an existential danger to missiles not being the problem. Every single pillar of the original justification for this war has been quietly walked back, repackaged, or flatly denied, while the deal gets sold to the public as a victory lap. So where does that leave things right now, on June 18th, 2026, as the world watches Trump defend this agreement while critics question nearly every concession buried inside it? Trump has hit back directly at that criticism, telling reporters that anyone who thinks he hasn't been tough enough on Tehran is, in his exact words, either jealous, bad people, or stupid. A severe weather event, a natural disaster, a power grid disruption lasting more than a day, a regional boil water advisory. Any of these circumstances removes access to clean water for a household while simultaneously increasing a pet's hydration and stress management needs. A cat who stops drinking during a household disruption because the water source has changed character, because stress has suppressed her normal patterns, because the routine that made drinking habitual has been broken, and will progress toward urinary concentration and potential obstruction faster than her owner can organize emergency veterinary access during a community-wide crisis in which every clinic in the region is operating under the same capacity pressure at the same moment. Electrolyte support products formulated specifically for pets, bottled water, stored as part of household emergency supplies that explicitly account for per-animal daily consumption requirements, and oral rehydration solutions that veterinarians identify as safe for hydration emergencies are the products that pet owners in disaster-affected communities consistently report wishing they had maintained before the event that made them necessary. Now, understand the specific mistake that most people will make after hearing everything this analysis has just explained. They will understand it. They will acknowledge the risks as real and documented. They will feel the specific urgency of the information at the level of comprehension. And then they will set it aside and do nothing different tomorrow than they did yesterday. Because the specific friction of acting on preparedness information is always higher in the moment than the friction of acknowledging it intellectually. The shelf was full last week. It will probably be full next week. Charlie is someone else's dog. The disruption is something that happens somewhere else. This is the specific cognitive pattern that produces the empty shelf experience, not catastrophic mismanagement, not willful ignorance, just the ordinary human tendency to defer action on a risk that has not yet materialized to an indefinite future moment when the urgency feels more immediate. Charlie's owner was not an unprepared person. She was attentive, medically engaged, and dedicated to her dog's care. She had never missed a veterinary appointment. She understood the prescription diet's importance to his kidney management protocol. She simply had not made the specific logistical decision to maintain a buffer, because the shelf had always had what she needed every previous time she went to buy it, until the day it did not. And that day arrived without warning on a Tuesday morning when she had one bag left, no margin, and nowhere to turn that produced what she needed on the timeline Charlie's kidneys required. The families who navigated the 2020 and 2021 pet supply disruptions without crisis were not fundamentally different in resources, intelligence, or dedication from the families who did not navigate them well. They had made one decision before the disruption, the decision to maintain a small buffer ahead of the immediate need. That buffer cost them nothing except a slightly higher purchase quantity in the weeks before the shelves went bare. In most cases, the disruptions were resolved before the buffer ran out, which meant the buffer existed the entire time and was never actually consumed. The cost of maintaining it was planning and storage space. The benefit was immunity to a supply chain event that disrupted every neighbor who had not made the same decision. That is the specific arithmetic that makes preparedness rational rather than anxious. The cost of having it, small, spread across time, manageable. The cost of not having it at the specific moment the supply chain fails, large, concentrated, and experienced all at once with a living animal depending on a solution that the preparation would have already provided. The probability of needing the buffer at some point in the current supply chain environment is not speculative. It is documented in the April 2026 Consumer Affairs reporting on empty cat food shelves at Walmart. It is documented in the FDA's animal drug shortage tracking. It is documented in the pet food industry's acknowledgement of structural manufacturing constraints. It is documented in the confirmed 41% Chinese pharmaceutical ingredient shipment decline. It is documented in the bentonite distribution gaps, producing regional litter outages across the Southeast. Cannot call a pharmacy, cannot drive to the next store, and cannot explain in words what it needs when what it has always had is suddenly unavailable. The commitment of pet household supply chain that meets those needs consistently, regardless of what the external supply chain is doing on any given Tuesday morning. The 12 items on this list are the practical translation of that commitment into action. Not excess, not panic, not the kind of stockpiling that creates the shortage it claims to prepare for. A 30-day buffer of a prescription diet, a 3-month supply of flea prevention, a 6-month supply of heartworm prevention, a 60-day supply of joint supplements for the senior animal who needs them every day to remain comfortable, a 1-month supply of cat litter, a 2-month buffer of the boutique freeze-dried formula whose supply chain fragility is the highest of any product category your animal eats, a first aid kit assembled when everything is available rather than assembled in crisis when one specific thing is needed. Every item on this list exists on shelves right now. The prices today, despite the inflationary pressure that has already pushed pet food costs significantly higher than they were 3 years ago, are in most cases lower than the prices that tariff impacts, ingredient cost pressures, and structural manufacturing constraints will produce in the months ahead. The logical arithmetic of buying before the shortage is simpler and less expensive than solving for the shortage after it has already arrived. Buy it now, store it appropriately, rotate through it as you use it so freshness is maintained and nothing is wasted. And be the owner who drove home past the empty shelf calmly with nothing to worry about, because the buffer at home absorbed the disruption before it ever reached your animal's bowl. The supply chain pressures are not theoretical. The structural manufacturing constraints are not speculative projections. The tariff impacts on pharmaceutical ingredient sourcing are confirmed operational realities working their way through the distribution networks right now. The empty shelves that Consumer Affairs documented in April 2026 are the downstream arrival of upstream pressures that were visible for months before they reached retail, and the preparation that would have made those empty shelves irrelevant to 94 million American pet-owning households was available to every one of them before the sign was written and taped to the shelf rail. The warning is the difference between the person who reads the sign and goes home to a stocked cabinet and the person who reads the sign and starts making phone calls. The warning, received in time and acted on, transforms a supply chain disruption from a crisis into a non-event that a prepared household does not notice because the buffer absorbed it before it ever became visible. The warning received too late, after the shelf is already empty, is information that costs. It's also worth stepping back to understand that this entire saga didn't start in a vacuum. It was built on top of an even earlier round of fighting that most casual observers had already half forgotten about. Back in June 2025, what became known as the 12-Day War began on June 13th with those surprise Israeli strikes. And it technically ended with a ceasefire on June 24th, 2025, just 2 days after Operation Midnight Hammer. That ceasefire was supposed to be the end of the story. It wasn't. It was merely the opening chapter of a much longer, messier sequence that would stretch across the following year. The Fordo facility itself had been under American intelligence watch since 2006, when its construction inside that remote northwestern Iranian mountain was first discovered, meaning the strike that finally happened in 2025 was the culmination of nearly 2 decades of planning, surveillance, and strategic anxiety inside the Pentagon. 14 years of quiet observation, then 25 minutes of bombing, then over a year of contradictory political messaging about what those 25 minutes actually accomplished. In the days immediately before the American strikes, satellite imagery had already shown trucks loading up outside Fordo's entrance, a detail that fueled persistent doubts about how much nuclear material Iran managed to relocate before the bombs ever fell. Iran's leadership has consistently maintained that its nuclear program exists for peaceful purposes only, a claim Western intelligence agencies have rejected for years, with officials pointing out that nobody builds a multi-layered underground bunker complex filled with centrifuges inside a mountain for purely peaceful energy purposes. Iran's Atomic Energy Organization condemned the American strikes as a barbaric violation of international law, specifically citing the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and vowed to pursue justice through international courts while continuing its nuclear program regardless of the damage inflicted. Iran's parliament went even further in the immediate aftermath, formally approving military operations aimed at closing the Strait of Hormuz entirely, the same waterway that carries as much as 20 million barrels of oil every single day to markets around the world. This is the part that rarely gets mentioned in the celebratory press conferences. Pentagon spokesman Sean Parnell stated that officials believed the strikes had degraded Iran's nuclear program by somewhere between 1 and 2 years. Not eliminated, not obliterated, degraded by 1 to 2 years. That assessment, coming directly from the Pentagon's own podium, already contradicted the obliterated language Trump used just days earlier, and it happened almost immediately, long before any of the later G7 walkbacks about missiles or uranium even entered the picture. In other words, the contradiction between Trump's claims and his own administration's internal assessments didn't start months into the peace process. It started within the very same week as the strikes themselves, hiding in plain sight while most of the public focus stayed on the dramatic footage of bombers crossing continents. There's also the question of what it actually took to pull off Operation Midnight Hammer in the first place, because the sheer scale of that mission deserves its own moment of attention before we move forward. Of the roughly 19 B-2 Spirit bombers in the entire American military inventory, 7 flew the actual strike mission, while several others took part in a deliberate decoy operation, meaning more than a third of America's entire stealth bomber fleet was committed to a single overnight mission. General Dan Kane, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, later told reporters that the Joint Force does not grade its own homework, deflecting questions about battle damage. Assessment back toward the intelligence community, a notably cautious answer from a military official otherwise eager to call the mission flawless and historic. The tension between celebrating the operation as historically unprecedented while simultaneously refusing to confirm what it actually destroyed is, in many ways, a perfect microcosm of this entire year-long saga. Big, bold declarations on one hand, quiet hedging and uncertainty on the other, with the public left to sort out which version to believe. Even the ceasefire that briefly held in April 2025, the one that came before this most recent interim deal, fell apart almost as quickly as it formed. Trump warned Tehran that month that a whole civilization would die that night, never to be brought back again, a threat so severe that administration officials later had to publicly walk it back, confirming it had been improvisational rather than a calculated piece of actual strategy. Indirect talks held in Islamabad around that same period produced a proposal for a 45-day ceasefire, which Iran rejected outright, insisting instead on a permanent solution rather than another temporary pause that would simply delay the next round of fighting. Iran's counterproposal reportedly included reopening the strait, ending all hostilities, lifting sanctions entirely, and securing funding for reconstruction, terms that, looking back now, ended up bearing a striking resemblance to elements of the deal that Trump eventually did sign more than a year later. Sometimes the opening offer and the final agreement aren't actually that different. It just takes an extraordinary amount of bombing, diplomatic collapse, and political theater to travel the distance between rejecting an offer and eventually accepting something remarkably similar to it. If almost every major justification for this war, the missiles, the enriched uranium, the regime change, the existential nuclear threat, has been quietly reversed, downplayed, or outright denied by the very person who made those claims in the first place, what does that tell you about how decisions of war and peace actually get made at the highest levels of power? It's easy to get swept up in bold declarations in the moment, civilization-ending threats, total obliteration, automatic regime change, but those words rarely survive contact with the messy, complicated reality that follows. The pattern we just walked through: claim something enormous, watch it collide with reality, then quietly rewrite the story. Once the politics shift, is not unique to any one conflict or any one leader, but rarely has it played out this publicly, this quickly, and this traceably, with reporters in the room writing every contradiction down in real time. If this breakdown helped you actually understand what's been happening behind the headlines instead of just reacting to whatever clip goes viral that day, that is exactly the kind of channel we're building here. One video at a time, cutting through the noise and laying out the receipts so you can form your own opinion instead of being handed someone else's. So if you made it this far, you already know what to do. Like this video, subscribe if you haven't already, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next time this story shifts again, because if this pattern holds, it probably will. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.